Thank you very much. Thanks for doing all of that it was in 20 minutes, pretty much. I think you've set a wonderful program for us to be able to come back to actually later on. I'm sure we'll get back to the issue of institutions as we go on. I mean, you talked a little bit about the drivers of potential fragility within states. You gave a great list of the solutions, and you reminded us of the huge set of challenges that face those individuals and groups that now have to try to put the two together. Without more ado, let me turn around to Julian. Julian, you've got your 7.5.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you, ODI. Great pleasure to be here. I'm not going to stand up, it'll take too much time, so I'll get on with it from here if you can all hear me.
That'll help.
That'll help, absolutely. I read the background paper, which was an excellent paper with great interest, and what I want to do is kind of build on what Donald has said, but address some of the fundamental assumptions in the paper, because a lot of my work is with the military, and there is an issue here, guys. There's a lot of work we have to do on this, and I'm going to cover that particular area. And I suspect, therefore, I might come across as a bit of a dog in the manger, but hey, I'm from Yorkshire, so it doesn't matter. Now, one of my current tasks is as senior political advisor to the Commandant of the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps. And what I want to do is give a sit-rep from that perspective, particularly for the UK. And I've written 2 big reports on Afghanistan in the last 18 months, one for NATO and one for Chiefs of Defence Staff. And I suppose my core message to you is this: if we cannot strike a balance and soon between efficiency and effectiveness, and move beyond the rhetorical comprehensive approach for all the good work that's being done at the tactical, the field level, where people tend to make it work, I fear that the lack of strategic patience in capitals, and certainly the lack of disposable stabilisation resources, could well witness the international stabilisation agenda about which the paper spoke so eloquently, with its balance between values and interests, mutate back into something we don't want. A balance of power world in which humanitarian impulses have little value. From my travels around various capitals of the world in the last year, I do not see much traction for humanitarian impulses. I see a great amount of traction for issues like energy and other resources, and to do whatsoever necessary to get one's hands on them. But the humanitarian agenda I hear in this town doesn't strike me as going very deep in many other parts of the world. And I do counsel the UK in a way, which I think has been, a lot of good work has been done in the last 10 years. But don't assume that what's being done here is being conveyed elsewhere. Do not assume that because there is a genuine attempt to build a new way of doing security, that it's reaching out to partners around the world. Now, right now, we have a problem. It's called Afghanistan and the crossroads of the dark side of globalization. I spent last week in Washington looking at various plans. And it's evident that if the new people-centric strategy does not demonstrate demonstrable benefits to the life quality of Afghans over the next 18 months, then I think the effort could well fail. So forget all the talk about being there for years. What matters now is probably some significant improvement in the situation on the ground by January 2012. I'm prepared to unpack that in the Q&A, why that is. So we're focused on the here and now. This is not a theoretical problem that we're dealing with. It's a very real one. Of course, we will not call failure failure. We will declare success and do something else. But, you know, the work that I'm doing with Lieutenant General Shirif and his staff, with me in modest support, is part of an effort to operationalize the emerging strategic stabilization culture. And, you know, working with the military, who are very well-meaning, I'm struck by how far we have to go before they understand many of you in this room, and many of you in this room understand them. And again, we can further unpack that in the Q&A. Certainly, we have to bring our civilian partners very early into the campaign planning phase. One of the problems I've noticed on my various trips out to Afghanistan is the military tends to say, right, we have a plan now, civilians, please help us operationalize it. That doesn't actually work. I mean, we have made, again, improvements, but we do have to have a way, find a way to get civilian expertise actually in the process of campaign planning. It's absolutely essential. Second, we have, to my mind, never properly establish a methodology for understanding what success would look like, not just at national level, but between different groups. Third, we have never properly generated what I would say are a meaningful transnational set of metrics to measure performance across theatre. I did a big study into PRTs in Regional Command South. Different national stovepipes going back to different capitals with different metrics. It was very hard to know who was doing what to what effect in terms of the Afghan national development stuff. Very hard. We are making progress again there. We're identifying projects that could be applied across the country. But, you know, it's very difficult because national governments pay for this stuff. And obviously lines of command go back. So the devil's in the detail. Fourth, you know, making this famous comprehensive approach, and I've heard more versions of the comprehensive approach than there are NATO members. It seems to me whenever there's a problem and it's too complicated, we say, right, that's the comprehensive approach. We drop it in this bin called the comprehensive approach, and then we say, it'll be fixed somehow. Well, now's the time to fix it, because it is so complex to make CivMil work from the field up to the strategic level, and it gets more complex the higher up the command chain that one goes, that it kind of sucks the life out of the transnational effort. Now, even from my military perspective, I'm always amazed how much effort we put into preparing for multinational formations, only to deploy as a national formation the moment we go into a stabilisation theatre, because it's so complicated. That's why. It kind of sucks the life out of the transnational effort. And the irony is, it's the very transnational effort which gives the political legitimacy which must underpin such efforts. If you don't have legitimacy at every level, you'll never have any chance of succeeding in complex environments. 5, for all the well-meaning intent of the background paper, and I said I was impressed by it, so don't take this too badly, we are, as I've said, a long way from convincing many of those beyond Europe and North America, and quite a few within, I must say, that the stabilisation paradigm can indeed become a strategic culture. Now, part of my battles last week in Washington was to convince our American colleagues in the military, particularly in CENTCOM, who are a particular tough nut to crack, that in fact this is not simply an ad hoc way for Europeans to do their business. It's actually part of the emerging European strategic culture. It's the way that Europeans can justify the use of force and indeed the generation of effect. And that needs to be better understood, certainly, in Washington. And 6, I'm always surprised how political reconciliation is sometimes almost an afterthought. We never seem to have a political plan before we go. And if we haven't got a political plan before we go, because ultimately that's our job is to stabilise the environment politically, then I can't see success. And I have to say that I sometimes wonder whether we are asking our young men and women, both civil and military, to do what they're doing in pursuit of a very clear strategy, or simply to hold the ground until we back in capitals find a good strategy. And I'm really not sure as yet about which one it is. So to conclude, for countries like the UK, without true aggregation and concomitant political legitimacy, an enormous tension will always exist between intent and capability. Second, like it or not, in the short term, the future of the stabilisation paradigm is dependent on events in and around Afghanistan. The regional strategy I helped worked on the AFPAC stuff last year is vital. One has to embed it within a broader regionalisation concept of stability, which is difficult at a time when our political freedom of manoeuvre is getting smaller by the day. This stuff grew up in the 1990s, post-Cold War, the kind of unipolar moment stuff. Well, that's gone. Our freedom for manoeuvre is definitely not what it was, and will shrink. One final paragraph, Chairman. And in the medium to long term, much of the good in both the National Security Strategy and the Overseas Development Act in this country and similar in other European countries in particular will thus be dependent on convincing EU partners, many of whom have a very parochial view of security, that stabilisation in partnership with regional hosts is indeed part of Europe's strategic culture. You know, why are many Europeans in Afghanistan? To do just enough to keep Americans engaged in European security. They're not there to succeed. I've worked for Solana, I've seen this in action, I work inside NATO. Believe me, that is the impulse of many of them. So if the Americans waver for 1 minute, I wouldn't stand at the exit door to Afghanistan because one's likely to be crushed in the rush.
Thank you very much, Julian, especially for that final frightening image that you've given us there. But thanks also for laying out some pretty specific ideas as seen, I think, from somebody with a security and a military experience in particular. And your comments, I think, here are warning in a way that the kind of culture and thinking that has been cultivated in the UK in general, I think in places like ODI in particular, about long-term development strategies, is not necessarily being exported or at least absorbed in other key capitals around the world. And, you know, we cannot take it for granted. Success is going to be success. Failure will lead a return to a more, perhaps, anarchic environment.